What is mathematically the biggest possible hit that a player character could survive in Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail? This also means that we're making use of both barriers and damage reduction to mitigate the hypothetical hit as much as possible. And yeah, whether we're targeting just one player or a whole party might change some things, so we will investigate both. And be sure to let me know your predictions for the results in the comments. But before any of that, let's start by checking the rules. 1. The setup, meaning barriers and other mitigation, must be producible in any content that allows the party size that is required for the cast. This means, for example, that relying on echo from unsynced content to have more HP or bigger shields is off limits. Field operation exclusive options from Eureka, Bosha and the Cold Crescent are also banned. Even something like Variant Rampart from Variant Dungeons are banned. 2. Invulnerability is considered cheating. Additionally, there exist mechanics that specifically ignore invulns while not ignoring normal mitigation. There also exist mechanics that ignore both, but the no invulns allowed restriction is more common. 3. If applicable, any actions used for the setup will be assumed to be a critical hit, regardless of the probability of that. 4. While parrying would decrease damage further, a large amount of heavy-hitting attacks straight up cannot be parried in the first place. As such, we will not count parrying for the calculation. However, if you want to count it yourself, divide the physical mitigation effective HP at any time by an additional 0.85. This will make sense in a bit. Now, with the rules out of the way, let's go over some important mechanical details of the setup. How mitigation stacks, how defense works, and effective HP. Some of these will be very obvious to some of you, I'm sure, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, we go over it. How mitigation stacks. Damage reduction buffs in 14 stack multiplicatively, meaning A times B. Here's an example of how to add them together. If you have a 20% and a 30% damage reducing buff, then you invert them by subtracting them from 100%, meaning you actually have a I take 80% damage buff and a I take 70% damage buff. Then you multiply those numbers together. 80% times 70% equals 56%. And if you invert it again, you now have I take 44% less damage. Admittedly, the 56% is a lot more useful for most of our other calculations, so you may see me not bother to flip it back. How defense works. All player characters have a defense and magic defense stat from their gear. Even crafters and gatherers do. It is commonly known that tanks have by far the most in both. Mages and healers have the second most magic defense, while Reaper and Dragoon are second place on physical defense. Then, the rest of the DPS have even amounts in both, meaning the least in magic defense, and then mages and healers have the least physical defense. The way defense provides mitigation is, shockingly, a linearly scaling multiplier, which does mean that if there was no limit to how much defense you could accumulate without leveling up, it would be realistically possible to reach 100% mitigation from defense alone. At level 100 in Dawntrail, the scaling is 1% mitigation every 185.333, repeating of course, points of defense, or 3% every 556 points. Meaning that a tank in full best-in-slot gear with 7,420 in both defenses peaks at 40% mitigation for both damage types. Here's a list for all the roles. Practically, we simply need to take note of this defense as an extra defensive cooldown, and it does mean that the damage type might matter for the final result. Effective HP. While stacking together mitigation percentages to get an incredibly small number is fun, it is often a lot easier to understand the defensive value of these effects if we translate them to a comparatively big number instead to compare against the incoming damage. Effective HP, or EHP, inverts the value of mitigation by using it as a health multiplier instead. A simple example is whether you have 100 HP and take half damage, or simply have 200 HP, is equally helpful for tanking a fixed amount of damage in an instant, because both have the same effective HP. 100 divided by 0.5 equals 200. What is really smart about EHP is that instead of having to go through calculating how much damage an attack actually does after mitigation, if you have the EHP number, all you really need to know is whether EHP is more than the hit to know whether you live it or not. Barriers increase the base number, and damage reduction multiplies it. So, for example, just from the defense before, a Sea Wolf race tank has a baseline EHP of 542,103, with a warrior specifically having 542,437 thanks to just baseline having 200 more than the other tanks. A caster taking a magic hit would have 285,219 EHP, while a ranged physical taking any hit has 290,485, which is very interesting, because that means, despite mages having significantly more magic defense, they are still the weakest at taking a magic hit without barrier help. And with all of that out of the way, we can now rank who takes a single hit alone the best. It should probably come as no surprise that tanks and healers take 8 of the top spots, so just to not entirely ignore the much closer contest between the DPS, let's cover all of them, but maybe a bit faster than usual. Dead last in 20th place, we have Red Mage on the physical side with 257,000 EHP, and Viper on the magical side with 306k EHP, both only having a role action to support them. In 19th place, bringing something personally to the table for physical mid with a barrier, we have a shared spot between Summoner and Pictomancer, both with 309k EHP. And for magic, Dragoon legitimately beating Viper simply by having slightly more base health, leading to 307k. 18th physical place, we have Viper again, with Feint's more physical leading effect placing it at 323k. For magic, Reaper's Arcane Crest places it at 338k. In 17th physical, Black Mage's Mana Ward places it at 335k, with Samurai on the magic side slightly higher at 340k, thanks to Tengetsu. 16th place for both types of damage goes to Bard with 342k, simply by having a strong mitigation like Troubadour. And for 15th physical place, Dragoon comes in by simply having armor, placing it at 351k. And for magic, Red Mage's magic barrier lands it at 352k. In the 14th physical place, thanks to Feint once again, Samurai jumps in with 359k. And on the magic side, Ninja's Shadeshift gives it a slight edge, placing it at 367k. Put your hands down. In 13th place, we have yet another ranged physical, with Dancer adding in the barrier of improvised finish to place it at 376k, taking both slots. And yet again in 12th place, we have Machinist replacing the finish with Dismantle to push it just slightly further up to 380k. And then in 11th physical place, we have Reaper with 386k, and the magic side once again being a shared slot between Summoner and Pixomancer with 380k. And now we get to the real top 10 countdown. For the physical 10th place, Ninja clocks in with Feint and Shadeshift for a total of 388k effective HP. On the magic side, Monk replacing Shadeshift with Riddle of Earth pushes its magic effective HP up to 383k. For the 9th place, Monk takes the physical side thanks to Feint bringing it up to 404k, and for magic, Black Mage swoops in with 412. And that was all the DPS jobs with nary a support in sight, because in 8th place we have White Mage with the use of Aquaveil, Temperance and its new Plenary Indulgence mitigations, alongside heavily stacked Divine Benison and Divine Caress, barriers for an extra about 118k on top, leads to a huge jump up to 559k physical EHP and 652k magic EHP. In 7th place, as a bit of a shock to many I'm sure, we have Scholar, with Sacred Soil, Expedient and Fey Illumination for the magic side, as well as Protraction and a big shield combining a humongous healing boosted Eloquium alongside a much smaller consolation, producing a combined 349k barrier on top of their base health. This leads to a colossal 846k physical EHP and 1,038k magic EHP. In 6th place, Astrologian sneaks just past Scholar with more solo mitigations helping prop it up, with Collective Unconscious, Bowl, Sun Sign, and Exaltation, and then on top of that, stacking a thick Neutral Sect aspected Benefic Shield with Celestial Intersection and Spire for a combined 295k barrier, all combining for 909k physical and 1,060k magic. And then, perhaps less surprising, in 5th place we have Sage with Keracholi and Holos, combined with its ludicrous Zoe Eve Creation Diagnosis Shield, further propped up again by Holos, Jaime and Panheime, leading to a combined 648k barrier. And with that much HP to work with, it doesn't take much to reach an effective HP of 1.25 million against physical and 1,463k magical. And that just leaves the tanks. An interesting detail for tanks in a competition like this is that tenacity suddenly becomes a lot more useful. In 4th place, for magical damage, we have Warrior combining a theoretical cap of 20.7% tenacity, requiring a relic weapon we do not yet have access to, with the maximum defense available alongside Rampart, Damnation, Reprisal, Bloodwetting, the Barrier of Shake It Off, the extra HP from Thrill, and the rather middling 40k barrier from Bloodwetting, leading to a hilarious 2,879k EHP. We are reaching HP numbers so high that an attack doing this much damage naturally likely would deal way more than that, and would be from messing up a mechanic you're not supposed to mess up. On the physical side, Dark Knight comes in with a similar setup, replacing the warrior-specific stuff with Oblation, Dark Mind, TBN, and Dark Missionary, leading to only 2,571k EHP against physical damage. In 3rd place, for physical, Warrior checks in again with the same 2,879k, while on the magical side, Dark Knight now getting more value out of its magic specialized mitigation, landing at an even more impressive 3,053k. In 2nd place, we have Gunbreaker, with a similar setup to the other two, but getting more HP from Great Nebula, more Mid from Heart of Corundum, and a small 25k shield from Brutal Shell, not to mention the mitigation from Camouflage and Heart of Light, leading to 3,271k physical and 3,453k magical EHP. Which of course means the 1st place, and was there any doubt, goes to Paladin, adding in blocking instead of camouflage and a Divine Veil instead of Heart of Light and Brutal Shell, and with Guardian's about 84k barrier, landing Paladin at a general EHP of 3,721k, nearly 10% above the 2nd place. Insane! So, for a quick summary, for mitigating a single hit with as much prep time and prep luck as you could ever need, Paladin is the strongest tank. Sage is the strongest healer, although it is worth mentioning, despite being 3rd among the healers, that Scholar is the most consistent, as it doesn't need any luck to produce the majority of its barrier, unlike the rest of the healers. And among the DPS, Monk is the best, although if you know it'll be magic damage, Black Mage takes the lead. One last thing we can do to push Paladin even further before moving on is to use a Vitality Gem draft, which turns out to increase a tank's HP by exactly 25,585, and with this boost, pushes Paladin all the way to 3,958k EHP. And now for a much more complicated question to answer. What is the biggest hit a full party could take? Now, an important difference here is that everyone must survive, so in a full, normal party, all that matters is the weakest link, which means tanks are effectively jokers that also survive due to how much mitigation they provide themselves. In fact, the long story short is that if we include any DPS to use their mitigation at all, they automatically become the weakest link and will require so much babysitting that it would probably have been better to bring not a DPS. In fact, Scholar, who due to the existence of deployment tactics would be the strongest at building a party barrier, would need Intervention, Oblation, Nascent Flash, and Heart of Corundum to not drag the tanks on their own down. An additional side note to this that bears mentioning is that technically, if we assume anything that can crit will crit, we could hypothetically have a Sage use E-Diag on each player, or the Scholar use Adlo on each player, or have an Astrologian use Aspected Benefic on each player. But I feel like while we are already sort of in fantasy land, keeping it to one cast at least makes it somewhat feasible to actually do. So that is how we will do it. So, what do we need? 1 Scholar, 1 Warrior, 1 Dark Knight, 1 Gunbreaker, and at least 2 Paladins. In fact, each Paladin can both Sheltron themselves and Intervention someone else, making their mitigation the most shareable. Not to mention, Paladin was already winning on EHP to begin with, so adding more of them would at least not be detrimental. The sequence is as follows. Everyone uses their Vitality Gem drafts, except the Scholar, who instead takes a Mind Gem draft. Then, the Gunbreaker uses Great Nebula, the Scholar uses Protraction on themselves, then the Warrior uses Shake It Off. After this, each tank uses whatever personal mitigations they have, with the express difference that mitigation that can be given away is used on the Scholar instead, or in addition to. And for the Paladins, they use Intervention on 1 other player each, so all 8 party members gain either Holy Sheltron or Intervention. We also get both Heart of Light and Dark Missionary, yes they stack, as well as Divine Veil. And finally, by supergluing 2 Paladins together, we can produce 1 combined party-wide Passage of Arms, instead of it not affecting the Paladin itself. One detail to note is that with no DPS present, the party bonus, which throughout this video has previously been assumed to always be 5%, is only 2%. Dragging down base HP and potential barrier sizes. This chops all of the tanks down by a solid 9k each on their base health, and the Scholar by about 6. The long story short is that the Scholar never overtakes any of the tanks in EHP, so let's simply focus on what happens with the Scholar. The initial Protraction brings them from 199k to 219k HP. Then Shake It Off gives them a 33k barrier. Reprisal means they're taking only 90% damage, and Divine Veil adds 10% of the Paladin's HP as a barrier, bringing that up to 67k. Put your hands down. Heart of Light and Dark Missionary combined brings physical mitigation to about 81% and magic down to 73%. Paladin's Intervention brings these further down to 58 and 52%. Passage of Arms then brings them down to 50 and 45%. The Scholar's own Fey Illumination brings magic further down to 42%, with Sacred Soil and Expedient combined bringing them both further down to 40 and 34%. Oblation, Heart of Corundum, and Nascent Flash combined brings them down to 21 and 18%, with Nascent Flash also bringing a barrier with it, putting the total there up to 98k. Then, Summon Seraph's Consolation produces a surprisingly large shield, bringing the total up to 146k. And then the boosted Eloquium brings the combined barrier up to 462k. And then TPN is added as a cherry on top for a combined 517k. And then finally, this genius remembered to add defense, bringing the combined mitigation down to 18% and 13%, giving Scholar a physical EHP of 4,133k and a magical EHP of 5,656k. Crushing the solo record Paladin had. For the curious, Paladin stands with a commanding physical lead of 9,708k and 11.39 million for magic, with Dark Knight closely behind on magic with 11.24 million. And then for the final, slightly less convoluted contest, what is the biggest hit one player could take with a team backing them up? For simplicity's sake, I will assume for this one that the attack will be magical. Additionally, I will assume we're limited to one full party, and I will leave the task of figuring out how much higher we could go with a full alliance as an exercise. Now, the obvious pick for the target, based on the previous results, surely would be a paladin, right? But actually no, a Dark Knight actually has significantly higher magic mitigation, while only having marginally less physical mitigation. The difference mainly comes from barriers. There's also one other reason to pick a Dark Knight as the lead. The team will consist of Scholar providing Protraction, Sacred Soil Expedient, Fae Illumination, and Consolation, Paladin providing Intervention, Passage of Arms, and Divine Veil, and the Passage of Arms is actually that other reason. Gunbreaker providing Heart of Corundum and Heart of Light, Machinist providing Dismantle and Tactician, White Mage providing Asylum, Aquaveil, Plenary Indulgence, Temperance, Divine Benison, and Divine Caress. Astrologian providing Exaltation, Collective Unconscious, the Bowl, the Spire, the Arrow, Celestial Intersection, and an Aspected Benefic Shield. Yes, it stacks. And finally, Sage provides Keracholi, Holos, Krasis, Physis, Hyma, Panhyma, and Eucrasian Diagnosis. Again, yes, it stacks with Aspected Benefic Shields. The combined team only has 3 roles filled, meaning we don't get maximum party bonus, but that doesn't matter. Starting us off with an early Protraction for the max HP, Dark Knight's own tools with a Vitality Gem draft lands us at 3.56 million EHP. The combined efforts of the Paladin slams us up to 6.24 million EHP. Machinist then builds us up to 8.16 million, and by introducing the Gunbreaker, we're already breaking the previous record, pushing us up to 12.54 million. With the Mitigation from Scholar, we push it further up to 16.3 million. Doing the same for White Mage brings us up to 23.68 million, and with Astrologian, we go to 32.48 million. And finally, before including potency barriers, we have Sage's Keracholi placing us at 36.09 million. With all the healing bonuses, Astrologian's combined single target barriers add up to an already colossal 560k. But when passed through this nearly 99% mitigation, we more than double up to 75.87 million. Checking in White Mage's barriers on top pushes us up to 90.93 million, and then Scholar's Consolation sneaks us up to 97.21 million. And then Sage with Hyma, Panhyma, Holos, and of course the biggest barrier available, Eucrasian Diagnosis with Zoe, brings us up to an unbelievable 171.45 million. And for the grand finale, with a tank LB3 weighing in at 80% mitigation, brings us up to a pointlessly colossal 857.25 million effective HP. Random aside from slightly later in the editing process, Kai, let's address the elephant in the room called buff caps. A very rough estimate is that we have about 10 more buffs than is actually possible on a player, and this late in the process I decided it was more interesting to ignore this issue. However, a very quick estimate tells me that removing the majority of the barriers and just leaving the biggest 1 or 2 options on would probably cut the final number in half, while leaving it possible while recognizing the buff cap. Anyway, just checking in to mention that I have noticed the problem, and have chosen to ignore it because the result is funnier that way. So, to summarize, the biggest hit an individual job would be able to take using all mitigation they have would be a Paladin using a Vitality Gem draft, totaling 3.958 million damage. A full party trying to do the same while making sure everyone survives would consist of 1 of each tank, but 4 paladins, as well as a scholar, and the scholar would be able to take 4.133 million physical damage, or 5.656 million magic damage. A paladin in that same lineup would be able to take 9.708 million physical damage, or 11.39 million magic. And finally, pushing 1 individual as hard as we can in 1 full party one Dark Knight, supported by a Paladin, a Gunbreaker, every healer, and a Machinist, would be able to take a magic hit of 171.45 million damage. And each of these results could of course be propped up further with a tank limit break 3, with the biggest number jumping to 857.25 million. Absolutely stupefying amounts. Now, I hope you found this insane multiplication exercise interesting. I will admit, there is probably a decent chance that I overlooked something, or miscalculated a thing here and there, but I triple checked as best as I could. Be sure to let me know some interesting results you've found, or a calculation you would like to hear about, in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Twitch or Ko-Fi, links in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, a really random distinction between Shake It Off and Divine Veil that we sort of gloss over in the video is that Shake It Off generates a barrier based on the individual's HP, so the Black Mage gets a smaller barrier than the Warrior. But Divine Veil's barrier is always based off of the user Paladin's HP, meaning everyone gets an equally big barrier.